Hey guys, this is Heidi with week 9 of the web design decal. This week we're going to talk about how JavaScript meets HTML and CSS and get closer to creating those interactive features that we want to add to our sites. As for announcements, we're going to release Homework 8 tonight, and that will help you get familiar with the JavaScript concepts mentioned in this lecture. And if you haven't already, take a look at the final project assignment on the portal. The main important thing is that you guys have your check-in with a staff member due Thursday, April 16th. And we just want you guys to create 3 mock-ups of what you plan on having your site be. And also, if you have your HTML skeleton started, that will help us give you feedback as well. And we just want you guys to start thinking about this, even though it's not due till the end of the month. And as always, come to our office hours, ask questions on Piazza, and give us feedback on how we're doing, especially since this remote instruction thing is new to all of us. In today's agenda, we're going to start out by reviewing variables and functions to make sure you guys understand that from last week's lecture. And then we're going to go over a new concept, JavaScript objects, which is going to help us understand the rest of our content. We're going to talk about how JS and HTML actually meet through the document object model, or the DOM for short. And then we're finally going to go over how to add and remove CSS classes with JavaScript. Let's do a quick review. Last week, I started out with talking about variables and how this is when we create a variable to store a value and give it a name. And the names are usually meaningful, like a noun, and you can store a different types of values, such as numbers and strings. And when I say string, I'm referring to when we just want to store some sort of text, and it has to be in quotes so that we can distinguish between just like text that we want to store and the name of a variable. For example, if this was not in quotes, then JavaScript would go looking for some variable named Heidi. But because it's in quotes, JavaScript knows that we're just talking about like the name Heidi just as it is. One misconception that I want to mention is that let's take a look at this code here. I have a variable let age equals 20 plus 5. So in this line, we've set age to 25. And in this next line, we say age minus 2.5. And the incorrect part about this is that it does not make sense to do some sort of operation without storing it in a variable again, because when we say age minus 2.5, then it's kind of just lost forever. We don't store the result of this calculation anywhere, and so don't write code like this where you do something without saving it, if that makes sense. So if this third line is the correct version, where when you modify a variable, remember to reassign it with this equal sign to save it in a variable, or you can put it in a new variable. So that's something to remember. I want to make this reminder about functions, that there's a distinction between this first block called defining the function and this second part called calling the function. When you define the function here, none of this code inside the function block is actually run at all. When you define this function here, all it does is tell the browser that there's this block of code named show greeting, but it doesn't actually create the alert or anything. This doesn't happen until you call the function. Calling the function is when you have the name of the function, then parentheses with the parameter you want, and closing parentheses. And this is when the alert would actually pop up. Again, we have this first part, which is defining the function, and then this second part is calling the function. And usually when we call a function that returns a value, like outputs a final value, then we want to store it in a variable. And this is, again, like I said, because if we were to call this function like square of 5 and just say square 5, then this thing is like lost forever unless we store it in a variable so that we can actually use this calculation in some later code. Now I'm going to introduce a new concept, objects. When we write code, we're trying to convert the world and how we describe it in English to a representation that computers can understand. So far, we've only talked about numbers and strings, but what if we want to talk about something more complex? A theme that you'll see in this course is that complex things are just composed of simple things. More complex web pages are still made up of simple blocks of divs, text, images, links, etc. And in this case, in JavaScript, when we want to represent a more complex object, it's still just made up of simple things like numbers and strings. Objects are JavaScript's way of representing more complex things. Each object is a collection of functions and variables. When functions and variables are part of an object, we call them methods and properties. So another theme that you probably know this by now is that I really want you guys to think about what you're trying to do in English before converting to code. For example, if we want to represent a car in JavaScript, we'll first think, what are properties of a car? I can think of things like color, model, the current speed, and what are functions a car can do. These might be things like driving straight, braking, or changing its color. And you would want to do this if, for example, maybe you're making a JavaScript game where you drive a car. Then, in the game, the car might have different colors or can go at different speeds, and that's why you want to save these properties and functions as part of this car object. So we have our list of properties and functions that we want our car to have. We're getting closer to code, because now we want to think about how we would represent these things that we're talking about in English, but as code. So when I'm thinking about the color and model, I think that this is usually described with text. So these would be strings. And when I think about speed, miles per hour, this is usually a number. So I would think, okay, so the properties of this car are this string called color, a string called model, and a number called MPH. Now, we're thinking about the functions. So, a car can drive straight, it can brake, and change color. And this is when we want to think about if the function takes any parameters as an input. For example, I think driving and braking are just going to be like these two functions that the car can do. Whereas when you change color, maybe an input parameter would be a string that's the color that you want to change the car to. Now, this is all just like something that I'm imagining, and I'll do a demo of this later. Okay, so now we have our list of properties and functions, and now we're actually going to write this out in JavaScript. So we have, we start out with saying let car equals, because we're going to store this object in a variable called car. And then we have an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace with a semicolon at the end. This whole thing is called an object literal, if you guys want to look into the more technical aspects. But basically, we have our properties and methods, and the name of them, each of them has like the name of it, followed by a colon, followed by its value, and a comma. So we first go over our properties, which are like the variables that are part of the car. And I have color colon red, model colon Tesla Model S, and miles per hour 0. And notice how the string is in quotes and the number is not. And there's a comma after each one. And then we have our functions or methods. And here this syntax might look kind of funny to you. It looks different than the function definitions we talked about before. But here we have drive straight is the name of a function, and we're not really talking about what's going on in these functions. But I just want you guys to think about how an object has a collection of properties and functions that represent something that we're trying to model in the real world. And yeah, wow, this is a lot of new syntax. But don't worry, we're not really going to be writing our own objects. I just want you guys to see this and be able to recognize how now, like, these variables can not necessarily just contain a number or a string, but variables like this one, car, can also contain objects, and these objects have properties and functions. And this is an important slide. So the whole point of why I'm talking about objects and properties and methods is that I want you guys to know about dot notation. So let's say I have this car variable that stores this car object. Now, if I want to be like, oh, let's get the color of the car, and I want to like put that in the console, I say console.log car.color, and the result is red. My point here is that to call an object's function, or to get the value stored in an object's property, we use a dot. So let's say we want to call the drive straight function, and maybe that will like make our car animate and go in a line, maybe. So we say car.driveStraight, and it's like calling any other function, but we use the dot to access this when it's stored in an object like this. So, for example, if we want to do our change color, and maybe this will change the color of the car on the screen, then we do car.changeColor. And I just really want you guys to be familiar with using a dot, and this carries over to other programming languages as well. But for those of you who have not seen this before, which is probably a lot of you, I want you guys to remember that when you're using a dot, that means that you're accessing some property or function that's stored inside this variable on the left. Of a tangent in talking about JavaScript objects, but now let's go to our main topic of how JavaScript and HTML meet in a web page. So on the left, I have a previous HTML example that I used before. It should look familiar from a past lecture, and it doesn't have much, just like a heading and a list. On the right side, I have the hierarchy that these tags create. And this is important because this is also similar to how the JavaScript side represents this page. So what I'm talking about is formally called the DOM, the Document Object Model. When an HTML page is loaded, JavaScript creates its own representation of the page, and it's made up of objects. Each HTML tag has its own object with functions and properties. Now, on this diagram, I've listed just a few of them, but there's actually probably 100 or more functions and properties of each of these HTML elements. So, some examples are for each HTML tag, they all have a class list property, which tells us what CSS class it has applied. Or each HTML element also has an inner HTML property, which tells us what text is inside that tag. So I'm not going to go over all these different properties in class, but this diagram here kind of shows a sampler of what each of these HTML element objects are. Our first focus is going to be document.getElementById. So document is a special object that's provided by the browser, and this document object already exists. It's called document, like a variable, and this is why we can't ever name a variable called document, because it already exists. It's provided by the browser. And you can kind of think of this as the object that kind of represents the whole page, your whole HTML web page. And for example, one property that it has is title. So if you say document.title, then it'll tell you what's in the title tag. And you know how the title tag is the text that appears like on the top of a Chrome tab or window or another web browser window. So like, for example, that's one property of your HTML document. Right now, we're going to focus on document.getElementById. And getElementById is a function that's in the document object. Document.getElementById is a function that takes one parameter, which is a string, and returns an element object that corresponds to the HTML element with that ID. So here's an example of what I mean. So let's say we have this line of code. Let list element equals document.getElementById parentheses, and then in the parentheses is where we put the ID that we're looking for. So in this case, in my HTML example, I have this unordered list element, UL, with the ID food list, and I say document.getElementById food list. And the output of this function call and what is stored in this variable is this JavaScript object that represents the food list element. And it has the same properties that we talked about before, like class list, inner HTML, children. And so, for example, now that we have this object, we can try seeing what properties it has. And this is completely on the JavaScript side. So we have this line of code, getElementById food list, and we say console.log foodlist.classList. And again, this dot notation where we're using a dot is saying that we want to access this property or function that's part of this object. And we know that ClassList is a property of all HTML element objects. And if you want to look up more documentation on that, you can just look online. So the result would be blue box, because back to our HTML example, that's the CSS class that this HTML element has. So JavaScript can tell us that on the fly. And when we say foodlist.innerHTML, so innerHTML is the property that tells us the text that's inside the tag, and we'll get back this string that contains all of the HTML that's inside the tag. The last property that I want to show you guys is .children. So if we say console.log foodlist.children, what's cool is that we get this list of objects, and not just a string, not just one object. We get back this list of objects that are the objects that represent the list elements that are inside this list tag. So, like I said, HTML forms this hierarchy, and the JavaScript objects representing this HTML have that same hierarchy. So it's cool that you can be like, oh, like, I have this variable that has this list element object for this UL that has the ID food list. And then when I say this .children, look at the children property, then it gives us the HTML tag objects that are inside this element that we're looking at. Anyway, so we get a result like that. But why are we doing this again? So I'm telling you guys all of this about getting the specific JavaScript object that represents an HTML element. To do what? So let's think again and recall some of our examples of interactive features that we talked about in the last lecture. For example, we said when the user clicks on this image, increase its size. And we talked about converting these examples of features from English into something that was closer to code. So when we say increase its size, we actually mean change its CSS width. And we talked about when you click on the button, you change the colors to dark mode, and how that corresponds to changing the CSS color and background color of the page. So now we want to get closer to converting these things to real functional code. And what I mean is that here when we're talking about our features, we always refer to something that the user clicks on, whether it's like this button that the user clicks on or the image that they click on. So in our code, we have to have a way of referring to what button or what image that we're talking about. So when we say this button, then we will have the actual button tag in our HTML, and we'll give that an ID, and maybe we'll give that ID dark mode button. So then in our JavaScript code, part of that code for implementing this feature, we would say document.getElementById dark mode button. So that way, in our JavaScript code, we would be able to specify which HTML element we are talking about when we are saying like, oh, we want to change the color, we want to change the size. Like, we have to have a way of telling the web browser which element to do this to. And that's why this getElementById function is super important, and we're going to be using it for the next few weeks in homework and lab, because this is really the beginnings of creating these interactive features. And as you can see, this next part about changing CSS is going to be in the next slides. We're almost there. Really quickly, I just wanted to show you a live demo of what I just went through. So I have this HTML example up, which is the exact code that I had in the lecture slide. And now I'm going to right-click, inspect. And as you can see, this is what I mean. I have my basic HTML structure. I have this heading, and I have this list element with these 3 bullet points. So in the console, I am going to do exactly what I said in the slides. Let food list equal document.getElementById. See, it even like auto-completes for you. It's great. And parentheses, what do I call this? Food list. I'm going to zoom in more. Food list. And this line of code will store this HTML element object in the food list variable. So let's hit enter. And so in the console, and this is something that you can do in the console, but not when you write JavaScript in its own file. Only in the console, you can put like a variable, hit enter, and then the console will tell you what's in that variable. And that's why the console is kind of fun for figuring out how things work. But remember that when you're writing code in a file, you would not just put a variable name, because this doesn't do anything. It only works in the console because the console can tell us what it is. And what we see here is that what's inside the food list variable is this JavaScript object and if you hover over it, it actually tells you what it refers to on the web page. So that's what's kind of cool. Food list has a lot of properties and a lot of properties. So if I say food list and I say dot, then we can see all of these properties and functions that it has. Look at all these. So many. Way more that we'll cover than we can cover in this class. But let me just show you guys what some of them are. So I think one of the ones that we said was foodlist.classList. And here we get back this list of blue box, which is the CSS class that I had for this element. Another thing might be like foodlist dot, what else did I say? Inner HTML, for example. And here's a string with the HTML that we have inside. And let me show you guys the difference between foodlist.innerHTML and foodlist.children. Foodlist.children gives us a list of the other 3 objects that are in this HTML tag. So we can click on this arrow to expand this result, and the browser console is really smart, and like if you hover over these, it'll tell us exactly what they are. So I just wanted to show you guys so you can see a real demo of how this these objects kind of translate from what we see in the HTML. And for now, like, I'm only showing you guys like, this is what this property has, and we haven't really done any of the interactive stuff yet, but that's coming up. The last part of this lecture is finally about adding and removing CSS classes with JavaScript. And I chose this to focus on because so many of the interactive features that you see out on the internet are all, the basis of those is all just adding and removing a CSS class. Like we talked about, the dark mode example. Like how that works is just that you click a button and maybe like a CSS class is applied that has a different background color and text color. And then you click a button and that CSS class is removed and you no longer have that dark background color and text color. So adding and removing CSS classes is really powerful because it lets us change the appearance of things that we've already created. So, turns out that the result of foodList.classList is not just a list, it's actually another object. So earlier I showed you guys in the example, so when you do foodList.classList, the result is another object with its own properties and methods. So now our code goes like this. So we say document, and so that we have our document object that represents our whole web page, index.html. We say .getElementById and use this function that's part of the document object. And when we say that, it lets us get to a specific HTML element in the page. And this is, in this case, it's the food list. Now we look in the properties and functions of this HTML element object, and we say .classList. And here we're saying that we want to look at the classes that this object has. And so, like I said, turns out it's not actually a list, it's actually a whole nother object. And here we can get specifically into the HTML tag. Now we're looking at this part that says class equals blue box. And this class list has 3 functions that we want to look at. There's add, remove, and toggle. So here we are. Here's where we can change CSS with JavaScript. So we have let food list equals document.getElementById. And then we say console.log class list. This is what we get. So let's say we already have a CSS file with various CSS classes defined. And so now if we write this line of code, foodlist.classlist.add dark mode, the result is that now our class list contains blue box, which was there already, and another class, dark mode. And if you refresh your index.html page, then you'll see that this dark mode class was also added to your HTML tag. And if your CSS, HTML, and JavaScript all correspond correctly, then what you should see is the styles of whatever you wrote for this dark mode class applied to your HTML element. So our full line of code is now like such. Document.getElementById foodlist.classlist.add dark mode. And here, just as a review, document.getElementById, this is a function, as you can see by these parentheses, that takes one parameter, which is the ID of the element we want. And for this last part, add, we also give it a string, and the string is the name of the CSS class that we want to add. So this is our full line of code of how we might add a CSS class with JavaScript. Like, you could technically just not write any CSS classes in your HTML and apply all of your CSS through JavaScript if you really want to do that. And here we have a similar result for removing a class. So here is what we have for adding a class. And if we say remove, and then we look at our class list again, then we can see that the class is removed, and visually you would also see the CSS change. Alright, so back to the slide on how we think about interactive functionality on our web pages. Let's see. Now, from this lecture, now we are able to specify which element we're talking about as long as it has an ID. And now we know how to add or change or remove CSS on a certain element. This final part, putting it all together to make this happen when a user clicks on something, is going to be in the next lecture. And I'm really excited to show you guys how to put this all together and create these interactive features.